Welcome back to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. Doug, it is a pleasure to have you back on the show. We've mentioned a couple times before, and today, I guess, is finally the day we're going to be talking about one of your books that you've hinted at a couple of times, A Teenage Girl in Auschwitz. How did this, can you maybe explain a little bit about the book and then how this got dropped in front of you?
It's kind of interesting because my books, virtually all of them, have been tossed in my lap, one way or another. I wrote a previous book called Surviving Hiroshima, a young woman's story, which we've talked about. And I was a hospital, my retirement job. I was a hospital chaplain a few days a week. And I, met someone at the hospital and she was interested in history. So she read Surviving Hiroshima. And then she came into my office and she said, I just realized I have a friend that I attended college with, and her grandmother was sent to Auschwitz when she was 14 years old. Would you like to meet the family? Oh, yeah. Yep. Right. Okay. Right now. So that's how that started. It got pitched to me. And my primary contact was the daughter of Basha, a woman who's about my age. And she really wanted her mother's story told for a really big reason. And so I was all over it. So her mother had left recorded testimonies, one with the USC Shoah Foundation, another with um, my mind just went blank. I'll think of it soon. But another university. So there was Basha's own. It's Basha Anush Freilich is the woman we're talking about, and so she'd left these recorded testimonies. And so there was a strong factual spine told by Basha. And in one of those testimonies, the one from the Shoah Foundation, I asked for transcripts because it's obviously the easiest thing for me to work with. But the Shoah Foundation sent me a video recording. And so before I'd even done very much, that changed my entire attitude because I was looking at documenting history, adding to the historical record. And I found myself watching a woman who was probably in her 50s at that point telling the story of what the Nazis had done to her and to all these other, at the time, young girls. And I don't, it takes a lot to kind of rock my boat. It really does. Because I've done a lot of stuff and been a lot of places. And, so usually I just kind of power through. But I was watching Basha in that videotape. And I went, I don't know how I went. I think I probably turned white for a beginning. And then I think I broke that 2 hour recording. I had to break it into probably 3 sessions because I got to a point where I said, okay, I think that's enough for the. So I had that. And then I had Basha's daughter who provided a lot of the personal details that I would never get from from anybody else's book, and that is really important because particularly the transcripts, because you're not just watching or listening. You get into that person's soul. And as I say, I don't normally get my boat rocked, but that one did it.
Well, which one for you, I guess, which hat took over your head when it came to the factor of you have your author's hat, you have your historian's hat, and then you have the emotional human aspect hat, which we all Don't like to act like we have empathy for other people, but some of us still cling on to it. But which one did you have to wear to create the book? Because you could have did it the Anne Frank style, which is just publishing whatever the transcripts were, whatever she was talking about, kind of like an oral history, but in a book form. But instead, you added some of that, but you also put in historical context, which I really appreciated because some of World War II. I didn't know anything really much about. And some of like, I think a lot of people, when it comes to the world wars, they know who was involved, maybe. So it was interesting to have that more historical context you added at the end of each chapter. But which hat did you feel was best suited for you in this situation?
First of all, the historical context became several very interesting conversations with my publisher and my editors because I felt that the context is critically important. My goal in all of my books, um, if possible, is to make that story, their story, as personal as possible to to what the reader could imagine. So that's very important to me that there's that to try and um, get that same connection with the reader that Basha would have had if she were sitting here talking to you, to try and get as close as possible to um, getting into the human side of her. And that goes along with other characters in this story. I mean, Hitler has, a story. Um, um, and a guy like Joseph Goebbels or Joseph Mengele, I mean, the butcher of Auschwitz, he was, where does a guy like that come from? Um, it just be, Reinhard Heydrich, for example, who is, high-ranking Gestapo chief. When I researched him, I couldn't find one single human characteristic in that guy. I just couldn't. That's the only person I've ever read about where you look at him and say, I don't see anything. I think this guy's naturally evil, and try to bring some of that to the reader's attention as well. So I would say, first of all, is I want to tell her story at as close a personal level as I can get, and and then add to the historical record. As it turned out, adding to the historical record with a personal story was fine, but I also pretty much immediately recognized that this 14-year-old girl had incredible inner strength. And so I went, wait a minute, this is more than I expected on this. And I want to reveal this strength that this young girl had because I believe this is one of the things I believe is that each and every one of us has inner strength, power, capabilities that we probably don't know are there unless we're basically forced to look for them. I mean, I've had this happen to me where I'm completely up against the wall, nowhere to go, no idea what I'm going to do. And then suddenly I keep pushing and this stuff just comes out. There's more in there. I can fight this battle. I really can. And I believe everybody has that. Basha demonstrated that so remarkably. She just kept going. And the reason she kept going was at the train station in Auschwitz. Well, that began not well at all because a lot of stuff happened before they got to Auschwitz. But when they got to Auschwitz after 3 days in a freezing cattle car, um, Basha's youngest brother, Shlomo, he was 6 years old. He had been sick and they got to Auschwitz, opened the door to the train, and he tried to get out, but he was all cramped and sick. And so when he got out of the car, he fell on the ground. Now, the first thing he thought, none of them had anything to eat or drink for 3 days. And so the first thing Shlomo thought of was his mother. And he found a dirty cup and he took snow, and he's still laying in the snow on the roller tracks. And he said, "Here, I'm going to take this. It'll melt, and you'll have a good cool drink." But he couldn't quite get up because his legs were, all cramped. And so an SS guard walked in up to him, pulled his pistol out, and shot him to death right there on the spot. And as I say in the book, welcome to Auschwitz. But anyway, his mother, there was no question about what was going to happen to him. So his mother and the two youngest boys were directed to go to some trucks, and they knew what that meant. They were going to go to the gas chamber. There's no, they had no illusions. And Basha's mother, Hava, said to her, "You must live. You must live to tell this story." And, in that world, if a parent tells you to do something, you do it. Yeah. So that was it for Basha. I will live for my mother because she told me to do it.
Well, there's a little bit more than that you put in your book, but we're kind of skipping a little bit later into the questions here. Let's just start off with chapter one when you talk about the train going into Auschwitz. Um, you might have to set the kind of tone. Everyone's heard the name and kind of knows that it was a horrendous place, but I don't think they know to what extent the conditions really were like.
Well, um, first of all, Basha came from a little town called Pruzhany, and she had a pretty good life there, until the bad guys arrived. And the Germans put all of the Jews into ghettos, and then one day they showed up. In fact, this was one day they showed up, grabbed the families, and they knew they were coming as they left. Basha's grandfather was holding her hand, and he had his cane, and he went out. And so one of the Gestapo or the SS agents sort of made an on-the-spot decision that he didn't look useful. So she shot him. He shot her father right here, right, boom, dead. And they scooped him up to take them to Auschwitz. And that involved a ride on open sleds in the winter, and then this 3-day train trip in a cattle car. Now, Auschwitz had been just an acreage. There was nothing there uh, really at all that was special, except one of the officers in the organization that was imprisoning Jews and gypsies and homosexuals, anybody they could, anybody that fell into that category of being different, particularly the Jews, because there was a real hatred there. So he saw this open space and said, I think we could do something with that. And so they made this camp. It was probably about as bad a place as you could ever fear going to. It was started, I think it was about 20 acres, I believe, and they built barracks that were barely livable. I mean, at their best, they had straw for mattresses, and they had latrine facilities, but at night they weren't allowed to use them. So they had buckets in the middle of the place, and any abuse, any deviation from the camp rules brought a beating, generally a very severe beating. And there's an example in the book, for example, where Basha is very, very ill. And in the middle of the night, the capos were generally Jewish prisoners who were given this special duty and got a little relief from the other part of the place. But the capo decided that she was going to go out and carry the two heavy buckets, knowing that Basha could barely stand up. But no, you have to carry them. and she did to the best of her ability, but it was completely inhuman. And Basha ended up falling with the buckets, which spilled all over. And yet, you just think along that line, what horrible conditions they were. Constant beatings. Um, yeah, well, one of the other camps, Booty, they had an electric fence, and um, and periodically they would turn off the electricity, uh, take a few prisoners, usually around 15, attach them to the wire fence, and then let their attack trained German shepherds attack them. And they literally tore them to pieces. And you knew they were going to do it every day, but you didn't know to whom, which was another form of torture.
Well, I think a lot of people know kind of like a little bit of the background about like obviously Jews were being hurt and killed and tortured and gassed and things, but I don't think they know to what extent. I mean, for you reading the personal account of someone that was involved in the camps and living through that, I mean, what did you start to realize? I mean, you mentioned it in your book, but it's the resident murderer that was in one of the little camp sections. And you start thinking, oh, yeah, you're not just worried about Nazis and SS soldiers, you're worried about other prisoners as well, too.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of um, the capos, as I say, most of them were Jews. By um, by serving in that capacity, they had to be at least as brutal as the SS guards in order to keep that position. If they remained capos, then they would have better food, cigarettes, alcohol. But if they showed any mercy toward the prisoners, then they got they got it just like the prisoners, lost their position, and generally went straight to the gas chamber. Now, these are people that once upon a time, not that long ago, were just ordinary Jewish people. There is a part in the book, Basha's father, Isaac, and several of her brothers, I think five, were all in Auschwitz. The youngest two had been sent with their mother immediately to to the gas chamber. Her father was with two of the slightly older brothers, and he they came back from a work detail one time, and it was freezing cold. And after they did their count, they let them into the barracks, which were marginally warmer. He didn't notice that they'd poured fresh cement in front of the barrack door. And so he went running through it. And of course, the guards went ballistic and beat him incredibly severely, and then took him outside, beat him some more. Then they, left him alone for a couple of seconds. The brothers went out to help their father. They got a beating, and they had to, if Father Isaac, if he couldn't work the next day, off to the gas chamber. So they managed to. They were by this time they're all beaten, but they managed to get Father to work the next day. But when they initially came into the barracks and the SS guards looked and saw the cement, they said something like, either you tell us who did that, or if you don't, we'll kill all of you. There was another man in that group. He was just terrified like everybody else. And so he went, that guy did it, and pointed to Isaac. And and then that guy, who was basically one of their neighbors, he had to live with that for the rest of his life. He ran into Basha at one time after the war and begged her and her father for forgiveness. He just said, I got so scared that I turned you in. And I never would have done that, but I was terrified. I didn't know what to do. So it is not just the prisoners against the guards. It's very often the prisoner against the prisoner simply out of trying to stay alive. Things like stealing food, that became kind of common. Also, the facilities were infested with every kind of vermin you can imagine. At one point, Basha was so sick that she kind of drifted off into I don't know, semi-conscious state. When she woke up, she was looking up at the ceiling and it was all moving. And she said, what's this? And she finally realized that it was all lice. The ceiling of the back was totally covered with lice. And I think it was during that same period they'd given her a sweater to wear. And she wore it for a while and it just started to itch. And so she looked at it and realized that it was full of lice. And she threw it on the barrack floor. And a little while later, she looked down and the sweater was moving on its own. There were so many lice in it that as they moved, they took the sweater with her, or, with them. And yeah, who would even imagine anything like that could happen unless you're confronted with it, like this conversation, or worse, actually being the victim of all of that.
What did Basha have to do to survive inside of her own camps?
She, for one thing, she just refused to die. Uh, Early on, when she was at Auschwitz, Mengele and his colleagues would periodically, like daily, go through the barracks, either looking for laborers to put somewhere or because they decided they had too many prisoners and they were just going to pull a few randomly and kill them. So early on, Mengele and his colleagues came in, and one of them got a hold of Basha. He was going to take her wherever they were going to be, used, sometimes for labor, as I said. But the worst was Mengele did what he called medical experiments, which were nothing more than grotesque torture uh, encounters. And one of the other troops grabbed her and she fought him. you know, 14-year-old girl, she said, I'm not going. And she pulled away from him and ran and managed to hide 3 days in the barracks. And when they did get her, the group that got her, it wasn't Mengele's group the second time, it was the regular barracks guards, and they just took her off to booty rather than whatever horrible thing Mengele would have done to her. So she just said, no, I'm not going. And nobody was fed well, certainly. But when she found that when kind of discovered that her father was in the same camp, she wasn't sure whether he was alive or in the camp somewhere. When she discovered that he was there, um, he obviously didn't look very good. So she got a few pieces of bread a day, and so she saved them. And she went days without eating what little she got to begin with. So there was one time during the day where the men's compound would be walking one way and the women the other, and all that there was between them was the wire. And she tried to time it so her father would be. She would come by at the same time her father was going by, and then she threw him the bread. So she literally, not only was she struggling to stay alive, but she was struggling to keep her father alive. And I mean, tremendous courage and determination.
She got to a point where she got so sick they threw her on top of dead bodies, thinking she was one herself, didn't she?
Yep. Um, yeah. They did. She was boy, there's so much in this story that's sometimes hard to keep track of. At one point, she got sick, and she decided if she cut a blanket and wrapped it around her before going out into the cold, that might save her, because if she didn't work, it was it. She was gone. So she put the blanket around her, went off to work, and one of the SS women um, saw the blanket, and she just got a world class beat down for that. Uh, at one point, they beat her and threw her in a ditch when she was unconscious. When she came back to consciousness, she was in this big water filled ditch, and it was red all around her from her blood. And once a day, there was a little truck that would come. It had the Red Cross symbol on it. It wasn't the Red Cross at all. If you went into the little truck with the Red Cross, you were going to the gas chamber
Or the crematorium.
or the crematorium. Yeah. And so she thought, well, okay. Um, she was actually calculating how many minutes she had left to live, because she knew Germans are very punctual. Germans are very punctual. So she's laying in this bloody ditch, and she could tell by the sun about what time it was. So that was one of the experiences. She had another experience where they let's see. There's so much of this that gets stuck in my mind. She had another experience where, as you said, that they beat her to the point that they believed that she was dead, and threw her on top of a pile of dead bodies. And but she wasn't dead at that point, you know. And the next day they came to pick up this big pile of dead, and she made a big point of walking from that latrine into walking into the van rather than being, you know, carried out there. And so they threw the dead and her in the van. And when they got to the facility where they were going, the morgue essentially, um, she stepped out of the van, or stepped out of the van, and the few other people who had been alive, um, who'd been shoved into that latrine area and not got out. Of all of them, she was not only the only one to walk out, she was the only one alive. And she did that over and over again. Right? But things like that over and over again. She just didn't quit. And she says in her interviews every once in a while, I don't want to do this anymore. I'm willing to die. But when the opportunities came around, she didn't. She kept going. Uh, she was sent to the gas chamber slash crematoria facility on one occasion, and she was a mess. She was completely beaten to a pulp. And when they got to the compound where the crematoria and or the crematoria was, they were also bringing new prisoners who hadn't really even been in the camp. They skipped all that preliminary material, and they had a train spur track directly into um, the gas chamber crematoria area. And so these people getting off the train were looking around like, what's going on with this? And then they saw Basha, who at that point no longer really looked human. And that they started asking her questions. What are they going to do with this? What you must know. And she was incapable of looking them in the eye and telling them anything. Now, it's interesting because she was drawing a crowd, all of these people, their babies. And then there was this one 14 or probably 15, maybe by then, one 15-year-old girl who looked like she'd been hit with a lawnmower. And now the guards started worrying a little bit because they were afraid that if this large group of people discovered what was really going to happen to them, they could have a revolt. I mean, obviously the prisoners wouldn't win, but they just didn't need that kind of a disruption. And so the guard came up to her. The people were told, the prisoners were told that they were going to take showers. That was the illusion. And so the guards would come along and have soap and a towel and tell them, you're going to go in there and take a shower. And Basha wasn't going to tell anybody anything. She was just completely beat. And finally, the guard came over and he looked at her and he said, "This isn't your time." He wanted to get her out of there as quickly as possible. I don't know why they just didn't put her to the top of the line um, for the gas chamber, but instead he said, "You're going to go back to where you came from," and they sent her back to um, Auschwitz.
Well, do you believe all the German soldiers had the same viewpoint or stance of anti-Semitism that Hitler had? I mean, there's a lot of them that just felt like they were pressured in a way. And I know that's hard to kind of look back and say that because people go, well, they all participated. That's 100% true. There's no denying that. But I have also read journals of German soldiers who were regretting and afraid that if they did speak out of line, they would be shot and their families would also be next.
That's right. That's absolutely true. And it didn't matter who you were. German officers were shot on the spot if they did something that was against Nazi policy. When the Germans in
Well, let's not forget the people voted in the Nazi party. A lot of people don't really remember
that's
that when
true.
it comes
That's
into the
true.
Nazis.
And there's a lot of twists and turns. And actually, that kind of a little bit of a sidetrack here, but a critically important one is that in 1934, Hitler took control of all of the media. So the only information that the German people got was the information that was approved by the Nazis. And that's one of the reasons that this is kind of a murky area because older Germans kind of went, well, I don't know about this. Younger Germans, they had never known the truth. They'd never been exposed to the truth. And that's one area where, the horror show really commences that young people who had been told over and over again that the Jews were subhuman and a threat to real people and they must be killed. You hear that over and over and over again for years, and you have no truth, no counter argument. They believe it.
What about the unlikely pair up between the Russians and Germany?
Yeah. Um, First of all, um, Hitler hated the Russians. He thought they were sort of a mongrel subhuman race themselves, but he needed them. He wanted to get as much land, Lebensraum, in Eastern Europe as possible. And he couldn't pull that off immediately, fighting in the West and the East. So he enlisted the aid of Joseph Stalin. And you probably couldn't find two more contemptible people uh, and opposites. Yet Hitler needed the help to conquer the land, and Stalin, he looked to get some advantages as well, and they split Poland when they conquered it. And what year was it when? Um, they split Poland in 1939, September 1st, 1939. Yeah. Uh, but then Hitler basically stabbed Stalin in the back uh, and attacked the Russians on June 22nd, 1941, and essentially beat them. That was, as I write in the book, that Hitler was on his way to Moscow, and unfortunately, the road to Moscow led right through Pruzhany, Poland, where Basha was. And back to your original question here, when the Germans, they were much worse than the Russians, and the Russians had to get out of there as quickly as possible. But some Germans troops were pretty much fine with the Jews. Um, there's a case where a Jewish man in Pruzhany, when the Germans came in, he ran into someone, a German officer who had served with in World War One, and the German officer, former comrade, said, you don't have to worry about the German troops. They're actually okay. But when the Gestapo gets here, when the Gestapo arrives, get out of here. Save your life. Get out of here. And of course, very few had that opportunity. But yes, there were um, some Germans who at least tolerated the Jews, but for a lot of others, particularly the younger ones, all they knew was the years of lies that they've been told. So I don't know. Sometimes I look at this information and kind of go, okay, well, what would you have done, Doug? What would you have done, particularly if you didn't know anything, or if you were told that these people you were going to be dealing with were subhuman vermin who were a danger to the world. How many times do you have to hear that without hearing any truth, just repeatedly over and over and over again? I don't know. I just don't know.
When it comes to Hitler and his anti-Semitism, do you know where that stems from?
That is a really interesting question because it doesn't seem to have come from um, his early experiences. He was clearly an odd young man. Any way that you try and you know understand that, there doesn't seem to be any overt anti-Semitism, at least none that I could track down. Of course, looking at the work of other writers, there just doesn't seem to be much there. And then during World War II, he seems to show a little anti-Semitism. And then, of course, after World War One was over and he was in charge of the Nazis, then there was a huge jump in his anti-Semitism. Why did that happen? I don't know. I really don't know. But it came from somewhere. Uh,
What about when the Germans realized they had an extermination problem at the camps? Obviously, they were gassing so many people. I think it finally caught up with them that there was other uses. I hate to say that word, but I'm wondering if it goes into what you have in chapter 8, where you said something like healthcare, where they really started getting into the experiments and the I think you coined it the systematic medical mass murder.
yeah, exactly. Um, so yeah, the population reduction in the camps was critical. Their real goal was basically to kill as many Jews as possible anyway, but they were just bringing so many in that the gas chambers and crematoria couldn't handle them. So, well, okay, so now we have a large dead population. What are we going to do? So they started stacking them. Well, then that became uh, its own problem because the treated, uncared for bodies laying all over the place. They'd stack them up, but it's a breeding ground for every kind of horrible thing, particularly in a facility that was already dealing with lice and typhus and you know, uh, uh, and the medical personnel, of course, at the camp said, "Hey, wait, we got to do something with this." And they'd requested building new facilities out of concrete instead of wood, so that creatures, little vermin things, couldn't get through the walls. Um, and the proposal was rejected. They said, "Hey, here's what you do: you have this plan, and twice a day you move the bodies here and move the bodies there." It's beyond beyond my ability to really understand this as a human being. Now, you mentioned not all of the Germans, hated the Jews. There's a story of a German medical officer who'd come in from, I think, from the front. Yeah, Delamonte, I think was his name, if I remember correctly. But he came in new to the camp and went to the station, saw the terrified Jews getting off the train, and then he witnessed part of the selection process and how the whole thing went. He ended up getting blind drunk and vomiting all over the place. And the next day said, "That's it for me. I'm out of here. Send me back to the front. Hand me a rifle. I'm not going to be here." And then he was turned over to Mengele for a pep talk that worked. It succeeded. He did stay, and as I said in the book, apparently a sense of humanity can be overcome, and that was Mengele's job: overcome the the humanity in that young medical officer. I mean, your head blows up when you think about this stuff.
When did Basha finally leave the camp and leave Auschwitz?
It was, I believe, May 1st. There was what are now known as the death marches. Of course, Germany had gone to Russia, and then they got their tail whipped. So they were coming back, and the Germans really didn't know what to do. Hitler, of course, well, they wanted him dead, but how are we going to do that at this point? And so they were released from the camps under guard like I say, it's called this death march. And they were sent off down the road heading toward inner Germany with the Russians on their tail. And they walked and walked and had no food. And uh, so they left the camp heading toward somewhere in Germany because Basha and the prisoners didn't know where they were going, and their guards didn't seem to know where they were going, but they were going. And so it was around, I think, May 1st, right around there where they started the march. Now they've got other problems because the land that Hitler had wanted in Poland, where Pruzhany, that whole area, that land was taken and given to German citizens so they could move on. Well, now the Russians are coming back, and the Nazis were really no better to the Russians, their ex-allies, and they were no better to them than they were the Jews. And the Russians were pretty darned unhappy about the whole thing. So when they started coming back, they just killed everything that got in their way. They didn't deliberately kill the Jews, but they did things like if they saw a group walking on the ground, they just assumed at that point that those people were German citizens who had given back the Polish property, their houses and everything that they'd been given by Hitler, and they were getting out of there. And so you'd have German aircraft flying overhead and strafe them, you know.
You mean
So
a
they,
Russian aircraft?
yes, Russian aircraft. So they could be German citizens, or they just made the assumption that they're German citizens and treated them like that way. So they're walking down the road, and overhead suddenly are these fighter aircraft strafing everything around them. As the Russian troops began to catch up with the Jews in the death march, the Russians would get their tanks close enough to just mow them down. Jews, Germans, whoever was there, they got treated like Germans. Uh, and I was going to say, one of the sadder incidents, how can you choose what's worse than another? But sometimes they just wouldn't bother to shoot them as the Germans caught up with them. Their tanks rolled in. They didn't use the guns. They just drove those heavy tracked vehicles right over the people who got in their way.
This is also a factor of the lack of sympathy after the war as well, too, that there's a lot of people not really, they were so numb to it, just regular citizens or just other allied forces.
I think that's the exact right word, is numb. And I understand that. I don't know, how much horror can you go through and not at some point in your own mental self-defense just kind of drop a veil over you and
Again, Basha trying to find a home and nobody really giving her the time in the beginning was a thing that I can't really understand because I don't know what those people experienced and what they went through, but it just seems like a human thing to do. But at this point, humanity was gone. There was no humanity left in these people.
one of the stories in the book that I find particularly moving is that when going through all of this stuff and the war is over, and Basha and the girl she was with want to get back to Pruzhany and see if there's anybody still alive, that they go to the house of a family where Basha had associated with the girls who lived in that home, who were her age. And when they got there, the woman, who owned the house, who Basha knew, uh, began to cry and tell them that they had to leave, that they had to get out of there, that they couldn't stay the night, they couldn't do anything, they had to get out of there right now. And Basha, of course, was confused, coming from this Jewish woman who she knew very well. And finally, the reason came out was that woman's children had been killed by the Nazis, and she just didn't want to look at a child who was the same age as her children who had been executed. It's just, you got to go, you got to go. And that was, I guess, her way of mentally dropping the curtain. And so, what does it take? What does it take for this woman who had these children standing in front of her, who she knew? What does it take to let them go on suffering because it's too emotionally painful for her? There's something there that I certainly have never experienced, and I don't really know how to unravel that one. But there were a lot of people.
What about Basha's anger towards the Allied forces for not bombing Auschwitz?
Yeah. Um, that's another complicated issue because she knew that the Allies obviously had to know what the railroad track going into Auschwitz was. So why didn't they do anything about it? Well, uh, the not bombing the track outside of the camp is pretty confusing, but the resistance to bombing inside the camp, the crematoria or those buildings, was that the aerial bombardment was not very accurate. The average, I think, accuracy was maybe 1,000 yards or 1,000 feet. It wasn't very accurate at all. So if you tried to use aerial bombardment to uh, take out the crematoria, for example, or the railroad track inside Auschwitz, they would be much more likely to kill a lot of Jewish prisoners than they would be to hit Germans. You know, and and that actually, aside from the fact that you don't want to kill the Jews, would be a big public relations problem because how do you justify killing the people who had survived the Nazis? That's a tough one. That's a very tough one. And the answer to that question for some was, let's forget about bombing. Let's just win the war quickly. That's how we'll save these people. And other people, I'm not talking about military planners. How can the officers, what to do with Auschwitz, whether to bomb it or do what, was a very, very contentious issue. And so those were people in the planning committee who said, yes, let's take out the railroad, let's take out the crematoria, and let's get those buildings out of the way, and we'll save some Jewish lives. The other side of that is if if they missed, the aerial bombing wasn't accurate enough, and so trying to save the Jewish prisoners by bombing could actually end up being just as bad as not bombing them. And there was a big argument over which way to go. Now, of course, Basha didn't know this. She's looking and she sees the aircraft, and occasionally, as in all things like that, one of the aircraft would mistake Auschwitz for another facility and would bomb them. Or again, in the case of fighter aircraft in particular, they would get their targets messed up. They'd think Auschwitz was something else, and they would deliberately attack it. And so for Basha, in their suffering, it's like, well, what are you doing? What's going on here? And it was very difficult for everyone to determine what the right thing to do was.
Were you surprised how the war crimes trials took place and how they kind of went about with, guess, punishing certain people? Obviously, certain groups were given immunity, um, for whether it was information or research or things that they experimented on. Like Unit 731 is a good example. We didn't prosecute any of those of Unit 731, General Shiro Ishii or any of those for doing the worst atrocities that are, in my opinion, worse than the Nazis, just on the basis of medical experimentation, but also for giving a lot of Nazi soldiers as well too, because we used a lot of their research, which in a case did, help build our space program. But also, the public became numb and kind of bored with the whole war crime trials to a point where they just started lumping all the groups together. People that should have been getting individual trials just started getting lumped into groups. And some people got very less jail sentences or less prison sentences, and then were out on like basically good behavior and go to live their life and die of some regular old disease or something.
Yeah, there's a lot of components of that, and you're right. I look at that, for example, first Nuremberg trial, and they prosecute Balder von Schirach for running the Hitler Youth groups. Is that a primary crime? I don't think so. I just don't. Um,
No, but Warner von Braun would be a primary crime of hanging the five slowest Jews outside of his rocket facility once per month.
yeah, uh, but
And that guy built our space program.
that's right. They needed them.
We
Um,
would have not gotten on the moon without that guy.
yeah, and they wanted Hitler. Well, obviously they couldn't get him. They um, there are just people in there in that group that I just kind of like, okay, they're the bad guy, but really, out of all of these people, that's who you
Well, do you
want to.
believe justice was served during those war crime trials, or do you believe that there was a lot of missed opportunities, all in the factor of
Oh,
time?
yeah, I don't. First of all, you're faced with the problem is that a there was no law, no international law that said that what some of these people did was illegal. There was just no law covering it. And so they made up laws after the war that they could retroactively apply. It's called post facto, great, post facto something. Anyway, it's writing a law to apply to a crime where no law applied when the crime was actually committed. Now I got to look at that, and that was an issue then. They looked at this uh, and wondered if they could do that because it really not. I look at that and say, well, wait a minute. So these people did this. Yeah, it was bad stuff. I got it, um, but it wasn't a law there. If you want to bust them for other stuff, I'm sure there's plenty. But to make this a capital crime, which wasn't before then, and then write a law that makes it a capital line and a capital offense, and then go back. Um, that's not good. And they knew it. They knew it. They said, "Well, what are we going to do? We need to get these guys." Okay, well, uh, let's just work around the rules, create our own rules. Okay, well,
What do you think were lost opportunities when it came to the war trials? Obviously, the persecution of certain individuals, but when it comes to I guess, justice of the people that did survive, they probably wanted to see a lot of people fry, and they probably wanted to see a lot of people, serve their punishments, but,
and
it didn't happen.
that's a very valid point because that takes you right into the heart of Auschwitz. You look at those camp guards and the things they did, very few of them were prosecuted. And I think it was like out of all of them, there was something like 60 who were hanged. I, that's a really good point. And of those who were convicted, but not uh, getting a death sentence, they're out in like 3 years. And for those who had faced life sentences and were sent off, yeah, well, 5 years later, you're out. And then there was, I think, there was a general amnesty, and I think it was around. It's in here somewhere in the actual book, but I think it was about 1957, where they said, okay, everybody's who's in prison for anything, um, almost anything, uh, gets out. That's everybody's free. It's an amnesty. Now, that didn't apply to necessarily the um, the people at Nuremberg. But if you look, if I can find it, I thought I marked it. Some of the horrible things that the camp guards did, and they were never prosecuted. They just walked. They brought him in and said, "Hey, you've been a bad boy. Don't do it again." Boom, out the door. How do you I don't know. How do you do that? And I think part of it is they just want to get it over with and, get these people out of the pipeline. Um, but that doesn't make justice. You know, is justice too inconvenient to apply? I don't
It is
know.
apparently when people stop tuning out or start tuning out from watching it on TV. It was a show thing. I mean, that was the whole purpose of it. I mean, besides maybe the first week or so they took it serious, but after a couple of months, it just became like oh, this is on television still, and then they just clicked it off. It was a little bit fascinating to me because I feel like we watched the Johnny Depp and Amber Heard trial for however long it went on, every single minute of it. Some people did, and it seemed like back then this one just everyone was kind of done with it. But what's your take on the Americans and other governments accepting some of these researchers and scientists who did horrible experiments and using some of their work? I mean, it shows you the competitiveness of war when it comes into the governments that are all kind of a gun at each other's heads. But really, when you talk about ethics, nobody followed ethics or protocol when it came to just serious crime. You don't accept these people, you don't use their work.
This was the beginning of the Cold War, and so is hanging von Braun a better choice than and letting the Russians possibly, get some information, or so we just take the advantage and the protection factor from having him as opposed to what might happen if we kill him and then have to deal with Russians over, some information that he could have kept us.
You can't turn back time for the crimes that they did commit, but you sure as hell can use the information that they gave.
And that basically is,
I don't agree with it, but speaking from a government standpoint, I guess they're more concerned about what the other governments are up to.
so what basis do you have to say that life is fair? Because it really, really isn't. And yeah, you look at that and go, I don't think this is right. But there's another factor that comes up later that is an example of that kind of sort of. The hearings starting in, I think, 1948 and then again in 1954. They're now usually referred to as the McCarthy hearings. And that's not exactly true precisely. But one of the things that no one mentions about that is that one of the scientists on the Manhattan Project developing the first atomic bomb was a Russian spy. And they get to talking about the so-called McCarthy hearings. Rarely do they talk about the Hollywood 10, a bunch of screenwriters and directors who really their crime was for not answering questions. I mean, basically, it was contempt of court. It wasn't illegal to be a communist. But all of this is being these poor writers and directors and people who um, were wrongfully prevented from working at their careers. Nobody mentions the 360 spies that were rooted out of the State Department. They're Russian spies. So okay.
I'd have to look into that though, because I mean, Hoover just had it communism on his mind. And it just seemed like Heath was looking for them all in the State Department. He believed everyone in the State Department was a communist. I mean, the really, real true examples are our CIA director at the time, James Angleton. Some of the closest people when he's looking for communists were communist spies. They were spies he didn't know. So our spy head director couldn't even tell that the people he was giving all his information to were spies. Robert Kennedy makes a really good point, which he says that he believed in the Communist Party or the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, that there was actual more FBI informants in there than actual communists.
Yes, I've heard that. There's two books I've got in my library. I don't think they're in this room, however, dealing with uh, how the 360 were rooted out. And we now get angry at McCarthy was not a real nice guy, but he was performing the function of preventing any more communists in the State Department. And but my point there is sometimes it gets kind of difficult. And I think this is just what you said. Who are the good guys and who are the bad guys here? So,
Well, history's not a straight line. There's not a good or bad side. It's just different. Like there's Hoover's moments where he's just an outright horrible human being, but then he's also got moments where he's apparently the best person that you could ever get to know. It's just everyone's wearing different hats whenever you meet them. It's a different impression. It's like that with war. I mean, there's not really any sound basis. You can tear up your own government and say your own government's horrible and do this whole rewrite through history. But when you look at the other side's government, I mean, they're doing the same thing and sometimes even more extreme in certain scenarios. So it's really about finding a balance.
I think in the case of Hoover, he sometimes would be about to take something on and he would say, okay, how do I want this to be resolved? And then go back and create the case that,
Well, everyone was afraid of him. He had a file on every single politician. The only person that could have took out J. Edgar Hoover was LBJ.
yes. Are you familiar with that clip of him, LBJ, bringing Hoover into the office and asking him how to deal with homosexuals?
Yeah, and there's also a clip of that best exemplifies Hoover's power or Hoover's kind of presence in the political realm. And it's when LBJ, they ask him why he wants Hoover to stay director for life because LBJ did that when Kennedy died. And he says, I'd rather have Hoover in my tent pissing out than outside my tent pissing in.
That that's a very Johnsonian way of saying that.
It's an old Texan way of saying, I'd rather him be on my side so I know where he's at.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, the post-war
It was a different time.
justice, if I dare use the word justice, is like you said, not a straight line. It's like, who do we need to show that we're doing something, and so we'll just drag these people in and do something. I don't know. That is that's probably in big situations. Maybe it's always a factor, but certainly at Nuremberg.
Now, are those audio recordings of Basha available for people to be able to look at?
Um, I no, I
Okay.
think you have to go to. Um, this is going to make me nuts. Either you can, I believe you can see them at the Shoah Foundation in Los Angeles, and can't think of it. I'm having moments where my brain just says,
It's fine. Well, just on a wrapping point here, is there a place where people can find any of your links, where they can buy the book and be able to check out Basha's incredible story that you came across?
well, yeah, all of my books are on Amazon, and this is, I think, a critically important book, as well as alarming. And maybe we need to get alarmed. And one of the big things I have pushed, as I've talked to various people, the fact that Hitler had control of all of the media, and not today, most of our media, about 80%, is controlled by a handful of people. What happens if they continue to go as they have been going? And because they all report the same thing, you know, it's not like when I was young and you had four newspapers in a city and, four independent television stations, any number of independent radio stations, and they all looked at the news and said what they believed it to be. Well, now they're all owned by the same people. And somebody sent me a a link. It was I think it was either 9 or 12 local newscasts, and this was supposed to be local reporting, and those 9 or 12 clips were word for word identical in most places or really close in others. So obviously somebody up there somewhere wrote all of the stories and then placed them in stations where they would look like independent reporting. What happens when they all decide what the news is going to be, not what it is, and they dump it on us. And then we're back in 1934. Where do you go for the truth? That bothers me a lot. So it's
Called programming.
yeah, programming.
Orwell was right. We all know. He was ahead of his
Oh
time.
boy. So, it's anyway, the book is available, probably more likely to find it online than in a
Amazon.
bookstore, simply because there's like a billion books
Nobody
out.
goes to bookstores anymore. It's all
Yeah.
Amazon or somewhere
And
else.
that's sad.
No, it's not.
You don't like bookstores?
You ever been to a library? It's awful.
Yeah, I have been to a
It
library,
took
not
me an
all.
hour and a half to get a damn membership card because someone in front of me just wanted to sit there and talk about a book that they were reading and that they were possibly going to be checking out the sequel. I'm like, that's fantastic. Let's move it along a little bit.
Yeah, no, I understand that part. There was, and maybe still is, I hope it still is, a bookstore on Sunset Boulevard, uh, on the Strip in West Hollywood, Los Angeles. Book Soup. I love on a Friday night. I got nothing to do. I'm going to go to Book Soup and see what's there.
As long as you're not sitting on your laptop at a coffee shop for like 6 hours, that's fine.
That
I don't like
I
those
think
people.
that's
That's
kind of
rough.
a psychology experiment more so.
Now it's just so people see you're doing work. You can do work on your phone. I do it on the toilet and I get more work done half these people in a coffee shop.
Yeah, well, that's probably true. That's probably true.
Now it
Uh,
is okay to hang out for a little bit of time. I'm just saying 6 hours is a lot. Okay.
no, oh, geez, no.
Pace yourself.
First of all, if I had to sit in a place like that for 6 hours, they'd take me out on a gurney. That's not.
I feel like your ass would get numb.
You know, I can sit here in my cluttered little office, and this happens all the time. I click one thing on Wikipedia. Somebody says something about somebody. Oh, I didn't know that, so I click on the thing. You'll find me there 6 hours later because I go from link to link to link.
Rabbit holes,
I
man.
love them.
They're fun.
I love that.
Do it in your home when you can, you're not bothering anybody. But if you're in the middle of a
Exactly.
Starbucks line on your phone diving in rabbit holes, I'm like, hey man, buy a Michael Jackson CD and move on. Like I hate to be that guy, but no, Doug, I'm gonna link all your links in the description. I'm gonna link your website, Amazon links. Anybody that wants to find out what more about Basha's story can go buy Doug's book and be able to check out the story and the things that he has in there when it comes to historical perspective as well too. After each chapter, which I really appreciate. But I appreciate you, Doug, for joining me again. And thanks everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. Stay tuned for our next episode.